This is Saturday Agenda.
G'day and welcome to the program. I'm David Lipson. On the show today, Big Brother getting bigger. We'll examine the furore over the US monitoring of the German Chancellor's mobile phone and also look into how prominent electronic surveillance is in this country. Also today, the Commonwealth Bank reportedly sending private investigators to a coalition fundraiser. What's all that about? Well, first, let's go to our panel. I am joined by the Shadow Minister for Financial Services, among other things, Bernie Ripoll, and also Liberal MP Kelly O'Dwyer. Thanks for your time today to both of you. First to you, Kelly O'Dwyer. Private investigators sent to a fundraiser for your coalition colleague John Williams. What do you make of that?
Well, I'm not quite sure that that's how I read the article, David. They were clearly pursuing somebody who attended this particular event, according to the newspaper reports today. It's a very interesting story, and I'm sure that the Commonwealth Bank will no doubt be asked many questions about such surveillance.
Yeah, it was chasing, apparently, according to this report, an anti-bank lobbyist. But he was attending a coalition function. Should they be off limits to private investigators? Would you expect this sort of thing?
Well, there are clear laws that apply to surveillance and to privacy, and obviously if anybody infringes those laws, then the full force of the law should apply to them as it would to anybody else. So I'm not aware of all of the circumstances in this case, but I would think that the law applies to everybody equally with respect to this, and that there are probably some questions that people need to answer.
Bernie Ripoll, how would you feel if private eyes were sent to a function that you'd put on, even if they were chasing somebody else?
Well, I don't think any of us would be particularly happy, and it's probably the second oldest profession in the world, and quite topical at the moment with what's happening right across Europe and the United States, of course. And look, I don't think any of us expect that sort of behaviour, and to have that sort of behaviour, I think, from the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, I think is concerning. But like I said, none of us would be too surprised or shocked. I read the article, and like Kelly, you know, I'm not quite reading into it maybe what you might be, David, but I still think it would be of some concern.
Just on the wider issue of surveillance, Angela Merkel obviously very upset at what the United States appears to have done. Kelly O'Dwyer, are you careful about what you say when you're speaking on a mobile phone?
Well, I don't think anybody would find it particularly interesting what I have to say on a mobile phone, but look, you know, everybody uses the communication devices available to them, and in this day and age, it's a mobile phone. If anybody's particularly interested in my conversations on a mobile phone, I'd say get a life.
Well, Australia also, just on the matter of intelligence, appears to be sharing intelligence with Malaysia now. As part of a deal brokered this week, intelligence on people smuggling operations in exchange for help from Malaysia to disrupt asylum seekers using that country as a transit country to eventually come to Australia. Bernie Ripoll, are you happy with that sort of arrangement?
Well, I think what we've seen from Scott Morrison and the new government is that they're prepared to say one thing before an election and do another thing after the election. It's quite clear. I mean, they were vilifying Malaysia, and they've had to go over there now and try to repair the relationship. And good luck. I hope that's been done. It certainly looks that way, and they needed to repair it. We were working in government with Malaysia to try and resolve what is a regional problem. People movements, whether it's people smuggling, drugs, firearms, whatever it might be, is not just an issue isolated to Australia, but it involves our whole region. And anything we can do with our neighbours in terms of agreements, even if that includes sharing on agreement some bits of intelligence, and I think that's the right step forward. But you're not going to hear from me criticism about any government trying to actually do the right thing in the region, unlike the previous government who were trying to fix a political problem, not a people smuggling problem.
Kelly O'Dwyer, the coalition was very critical in opposition of Labor's attempts to deal with Malaysia on people smuggling. Why is it okay now to find a solution for with Malaysia?
Well, it's a completely different question, David, and that's the important point to note here. Bernie's trying to suggest that somehow we're doing what Labor did, and we're not. They wanted a people swap arrangement. We said that that wouldn't work, and it didn't work. We said instead that you should work with your neighbours within the region, as well as implement a number of successful policies that had worked under the previous Howard government.
Malaysia could have worked. I'm sorry to interrupt. Malaysia could have worked, though, had you supported it. The changes to the laws to get around that High Court ruling.
Well, no, it was condemned in the High Court. They said it wouldn't work. The report said it wouldn't work. The number of people coming by boat demonstrated it wouldn't work. It was not a well thought through strategy at all,
it was never
which is
implemented.
why it wasn't supported. But
it was
the
never
real
implemented.
the real question here is, can we work with our neighbours to ensure that the problem of people transiting through other countries before getting on a boat journey through people smugglers to try and come to Australian shores, is there a way that we can try and manage that? And we're working with Malaysia, and that was announced by the Minister on Friday in his weekly briefing. That is the right way to go.
Bernie Ripoll, I heard you jumping in there.
Well, I was just going to say, look, the real difference now is not about the question or the answer. It's the fact that government's being allowed to do its job. And had we been in government allowed to do our job and try every possible answer to all of the questions, then we may have had some different outcomes. The reality is we were trying to fix a regional problem. The coalition were trying to fix a political issue, and the rhetoric and the vilification and what took place before the election was just hysterical. We're seeing a completely different attitude now in government, as you'd expect. But it's a bit rich to come here and say, you know, that it's just a different question. It's got nothing to do with the question. It's got to do with the ability of government to actually be allowed to govern.
Okay, well,
It's
moving
a
on
fairly
to...
important point, though. Fairly important distinction.
Moving on to the economy and the budget. And we see today that the Prime Minister has flagged tax cuts, perhaps as soon as the next term of government, and surpluses perhaps as soon as 3 years away. Economists have told the Financial Review, for one, that can only happen if key policies are abandoned and spending is cut hard in the first budget in May next year. Kelly, can the government have it all?
Well, we believe it's very important to grow the economy and to restore confidence so that business can invest and employees can have confidence that they have a job tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. It is something that the Labor Party didn't understand. For the first time in Australia's history, sovereign risk was a question that was raised around the world with their chopping and changing of policy decisions from one day to the next. We've got a Commission of Audit that is looking very carefully through the books to make sure that we are not wasting $1 of taxpayer money, and we have already announced before the election that we would cut the company tax rate by 1.5%. This is good for business, this is good for jobs, and it's good for our economy.
Bernie Ripoll, can the coalition do what Labor couldn't and deliver a surplus within 3 years?
Well, that's yet to be seen, but what we did is exactly what any government should do. When you're hit by a global financial crisis, if you need to borrow and spend in order to save people's jobs and grow the economy and do exactly what Kelly Dwyer is talking about right now, then you have to bear that responsibility and that burden on your shoulders, no matter what the political cost is. Because unfortunately, the social and economic cost, if you don't do that as a government, is that people lose their jobs, they can't pay their mortgages, it means they can't send their kids to school. Well, we took the very difficult but very necessary decisions to support the economy, support growth and support jobs. Hence the reason why today we're in a position where Australia's got one of the strongest economies in the world, AAA credit rating across all three rating agencies, and we continue to be in a position where we can grow out of what's happening around the world. I will always be more than satisfied looking back and saying, did we make the right decisions? Well, you betcha we did, and we took a very big political hit for that, but we had no support on the opposition side, who were prepared again on the key critical issues in the national interest, were prepared to pay politics when we were there to support jobs and growth.
Well, one thing we can be certain about is that there will be a big deficit in the next budget, close to $40 billion, perhaps more, and that's been added to thanks to $9 billion this week in one hit, where Joe Hockey has given this money to the Reserve Bank of Australia to boost its coffers. Economists and others say that this is a prudent way to go, but Joe Hockey this week says this should have been done under Labor, but we see reports in Fairfax this morning that indeed Treasury advised Wayne Swan against doing that, saying that it would be counterproductive. Kelly O'Dwyer.
Well, I think those reports are wrong. I obviously haven't seen the Treasury minutes, but I certainly know the advice that was provided to the House of Reps Standing Committee on Economics by the Governor himself of the Reserve Bank, and that was provided in a number of annual reports, which said that the Reserve Bank Reserve Fund had been depleted and that it was very necessary to build up the capital in that fund. They gave very direct, explicit advice to the former Treasurer Wayne Swan not to take a dividend last year, when Wayne Swan ripped out $500 million to try and prop up his budget bottom line. This comes off the back of $5.2 billion in 2009-10. This is not the advice that was provided by the Reserve Bank. It was yet another irresponsible decision of Wayne Swan. And I've got to say, Bernie, in your answer just before, trying to justify the increasing debt that you put into our economy that Australians are going to have to pay off now for years to come, you're clearly drinking the same Kool-Aid that Wayne Swan was.
But just, Kelly O'Dwyer, on the Reserve Bank, I mean, one piece of advice could come from the Reserve Bank Governor, another piece of advice could come from Treasury, and that's what this report is referring to, apparent advice from the Treasury saying, don't do it.
Well, I find that completely at odds with the advice, if it is in fact correct, completely at odds with the advice that was provided by the Governor of the Reserve Bank. I think he would be in the strongest possible position to give advice on what's best for the Reserve Bank Reserve Fund. It is an independent organisation, and he is the person who is best placed to talk about whether or not further capital is required in order to make sure that the Reserve Bank is in the strongest possible position.
Bernie Ripoll, the Treasury was essentially working for Wayne Swan at that time. Should we be surprised if they were telling him what he wanted to hear?
Well, I think all governments and all parliaments more broadly accept the fact that Treasury is independent and should provide independent, fearless advice based on its information, and the Treasury is different to the Reserve Bank, and you would balance up the advice from both of those organisations. If the coalition now in government wants to politicise either organisation, that's their business. We weren't in that business. We took advice fairly, and we took advice and made decisions based on what was best in the national interest. But we need to be clear on this issue here today of what Joe Hockey's actually done. Pre-election, we had a budget crisis, we had a debt emergency, the world was coming to an end. Post-election, Joe Hockey adds $9 billion more debt, $9 billion more debt, and he does it willingly and voluntarily and says, well, it's Labor's fault. Well, the reality is we didn't go down that path because we were being fiscally responsible. We were doing everything we could to manage through, which is what you do in these circumstances. But we also need to be clear as to where this money is coming from. It's coming right out of the hip pockets of ordinary mums and dads. The school kids bonus is gone. Low income support for people earning less than $38,000 in terms of their superannuation is gone. And small business tax breaks, more than $5 billion worth of tax breaks for small business is gone. That's where Joe Hockey's getting his money from, and he's adding more to our debt at the same time. So I find it completely unbelievable that this government would go out there, and particularly Joe Hockey, and make some sort of claim to fame about the fact that he's adding $9 billion of debt to the budget.
So you're saying that that money should not be given to the Reserve Bank, that they should make do with what they have?
Well, look, I'm not an expert on what the number should be. I mean, that's up to the government on advice to make those decisions. But that's exactly what we did in government. We took advice and we made some decisions at that time, and that didn't include adding a further $9 billion worth of debt.
But you didn't take the advice of the Reserve Bank Governor, who was pretty explicit in that Senate hearing when he said that he would prefer that the money, the dividends, were not taken out by the government.
Well, he might have preferred that. We're talking $500 million, not $9 billion, not 9,000 million. There's a significant difference.
Yeah.
And taking $500 million out of the reserve is quite different to adding a further $9 billion of debt. If we had a debt emergency, a debt crisis, as Joe Hockey was saying only weeks ago, then why is he adding more to it? Is the real question here.
Okay, look, I just want to quickly look at entitlements. This has been something that the Coalition's been knocked around pretty badly on the last couple of weeks. Bernie Ripoll, you claimed a study trip to France a few years ago, listed as studying cycling infrastructure. You did look at public transport in Toulouse and the like, but it also included a few days watching the Tour de France. Can you explain that?
Yeah, sure, David, that's right. Look, I took a few personal days as well. The study trip that I undertook was completely legitimate and within the entitlement, as is any other MP who takes a study trip. I did that in my capacity, not only as an MP, but also as the founding and co-chair of the Sustainable Cities Group. I've had a long-standing commitment to sustainable cities and different modal transport types. And this was a fantastic opportunity to see some of the best infrastructure in the world. And I've brought some of that knowledge back and experience back to Australia. I do understand how people can see this and sort of question how you would do this. But look, it's not uncommon for anyone anywhere. If you're undertaking a proper trip and you write a report and you do it within entitlement, that if you take on the weekend a few days off and you fund that yourself, that's quite within entitlement.
So it just happened to be that the Tour de France was on at the same time? Or did you actually plan that in?
Look, it was very fortunate that it was on at that time, and I did try to coincide it so I could have a few days. But I'm telling you that is the case, yes. Obviously to try and maximise the benefit of me doing. I went unaccompanied. You know, this was not some sort of a holiday. But look, I'm prepared to take criticism. All members of Parliament are entitled to a study leave and some travel associated with that. We've since now changed the rules around those entitlements, but at no stage have I been asked to pay anything back because I've not breached any rules or entitlements. It was completely within the entitlement regulations.
And look, we're almost out of time, but Kelly O'Dwyer, a quick response to that. And also, do you have any comments on Don Randall's electorate business in Cairns?
Well, look, I've never been on a study trip, and you know, I find Bernie's explanation interesting about the coincidence of the Tour de France.
Well, it's not a coincidence. I made that clear.
But,
it's not a coincidence.
Right. Okay. Well, you know, it's not a coincidence. It was deliberate. It was deliberate then. Look, you know. There are very clear rules in place. People have to act within entitlement. That needs to be signed off by the Member of Parliament. That then needs to be checked by the Department of Finance. And if people do not do the right thing, then of course they should pay back the money and they should be publicly embarrassed.
OK, we're right out of time. But Kelly O'Dwyer, Bernie Ripoll, thank you so much for your time today on Saturday Agenda. After the break, we will look deeper into the surveillance issue. Don't go away.